Roughly 20 kilometers south of Moscow stands what was once a place of silence, prayer, and faith, the Catherine Monastery of Sukhanovka. Built in the 15th century, its white stone walls had witnessed generations of devotion. Monks and nuns once moved quietly through its courtyards, their whispers of prayer rising with the smoke of candles toward vaulted ceilings. But by the late 1930s, those same walls began to echo something very different: the sound of screams. In 1938, at the height of Stalin's Great Terror, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, seized the monastery. Its location was perfect for their purpose: distant from the city, surrounded by forests, hidden from the public eye. Thick medieval walls swallowed every cry. The icons were torn from the chapels, altars dismantled, cells of faith turned into cells of despair. The sacred had become a weapon. The place was given a new name: Sukhanovka, officially a special-purpose prison. In truth, it was a black site, a hidden laboratory where the regime studied how far a human being could be pushed before breaking. When prisoners arrived, they knew at once this was no ordinary jail. Their vehicle stopped before massive iron gates, guarded by men in NKVD uniforms with rifles at their shoulders. No explanations, no words, only the silence of absolute authority. From that moment, every breath, every heartbeat belonged to the state. The intake stripped away more than possessions. Prisoners were ordered to undress, searched, and given uniforms deliberately the wrong size. Too large or too small, a calculated humiliation. Then came the descent through long, damp corridors that smelled of mold and fear. Each echoing step carried them further from the world of the living. What had once been a monastery of peace had become a fortress of torment. Behind its holy facade, the NKVD would refine 52 distinct methods of physical and psychological torture. Sukhanovka was not built merely to punish. It was built to erase, to turn faith into despair and silence into confession. Inside Sukhanovka, the walls themselves seemed to breathe. What had once been sacred stone now pulsed with moisture, absorbing every scream, every whisper of fear. Centuries ago, the monastery's air carried the scent of incense and candle wax. Now it smelled of rot, sweat, and despair. The NKVD had designed the prison with terrifying precision. Nothing here was accidental. Every inch of the building served a single purpose: to destroy a person's identity and turn them into an obedient shell. Each cell measured no more than 6 by 10 feet, barely enough for one person. Yet 4 or even 5 were forced inside. There were no beds, only wooden planks or the cold floor. Prisoners slept in shifts, 2 standing, 1 sitting, 1 lying down. After a few days, exhaustion itself became torture. Muscles locked, backs stiffened, minds unraveled. Sleep was no longer rest. It was pain. A dim bulb glowed constantly overhead. There was no night, no day, only a gray eternity. The dripping of water from the ceiling became a rhythm of madness. In that darkness, men forgot what time was, what their own voices sounded like. The air was so damp that walls glistened like skin. Rats scratched in the corners, feeding on crumbs and fear. Guards walked the corridors softly, their steps echoing in the stone like distant thunder. Every sound, the creak of a door, the jingle of keys, sent shivers through the prisoners. It meant movement, and in Sukhanovka, movement almost always meant pain. From the outside, the monastery still appeared serene. Domes, arches, the illusion of holiness. Villagers nearby saw nothing unusual. They heard no cries. The thick walls swallowed everything. This deception was part of the design. Sukhanovka was not a prison meant to contain people. It was a mechanism built to erase them. Every corridor, every door, every cell was another step in the disassembly of the human soul, an architecture of hell hidden beneath the face of God. Among all the methods perfected inside Sukhanovka, one stood out for its cruelty and its deceptive name. It was called the swallow. The word sounded gentle, almost poetic, but within these walls it meant one of the most agonizing positions ever forced upon a human being. A prisoner was brought into a bare stone room. He was ordered to undress, then forced face down on the floor. His arms were pulled behind his back and bound tightly at the wrists. The rope was passed through a metal ring fixed to the ground and tied to the ankles. Slowly, deliberately, the guards tightened the rope, bending the body backward until the feet nearly touched the back of the head. The body arched like a drawn bow. Muscles trembled, joints screamed. Every breath became an act of pain. After 10 minutes, most people could no longer think, only endure. After half an hour, the body began to shut down. Arms and legs went numb. Blood flow stopped. Some fainted, but fainting was not an escape. Buckets of icy water brought them back to consciousness so the torment could continue. Some prisoners were held in this position for 6 hours, others for 8 or even 12. When they were finally released, few could stand. Some crawled. Others were carried back to their cells like broken mannequins. Permanent damage to the spine and shoulders was common. Many never walked normally again. But the greatest injury was invisible. The swallow destroyed the mind faster than the body. After only one session, prisoners were willing to sign anything: confessions, denunciations, names of friends and strangers alike. It was not truth that filled the pages of their interrogations, but pain. One survivor, a German communist named Alexander Weisberg, endured 8 hours of this torment. Later he wrote, "After the first hour, I stopped being a man. After the 8th, I would have confessed to being anyone they wanted, even the devil himself." In Sukhanovka, truth had no value. What mattered was obedience, and pain was the path to it. If the swallow bent the human body to the edge of its limits, the furnace cell, known in Russian as Salatopka, pushed it straight into madness. Hidden deep beneath the monastery, it was a small chamber of stone, barely the size of a closet. Behind one of its walls ran a concealed heating pipe connected to an old furnace. When the heat was turned on, the metal plate inside the wall began to glow red. Within minutes, the temperature climbed to well above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes closer to 140. The air thickened, heavy and choking. Skin began to sting, then blister. Sweat appeared, then vanished in an instant, leaving the body raw and dry. Each breath seared the lungs like a mouthful of smoke. Guards called it the grease cooker. Prisoners called it hell. Those who entered were stripped naked. There was nowhere to sit, no shade, no air. The floor burned through bare feet, the walls scalded on contact. In that heat, time lost meaning. A minute felt like an hour like eternity. After 10 minutes, the mind began to slip. After 30, hallucinations started. The body trembled uncontrollably. People screamed, begged, clawed at the door for mercy that never came. One man, Georgy Tinkov, survived almost 5 hours inside. When he was dragged out, the skin on his back and legs peeled off like paper. His breathing was shallow, ragged, each inhale a knife of pain. He lived, but never fully recovered. Most others did not live at all. Doctors who later studied survivors spoke of dehydration, organ failure, and irreversible damage to the lungs. The NKVD, however, had a different term: highly effective. Their reports noted that after 1 or 2 sessions in the furnace cell, nearly every prisoner confessed. In Sukhanovka, even heat itself had been turned into a weapon. Fire, once the symbol of warmth and light, now served another master: the state that found in it a perfect tool to burn away the last traces of human will. If the furnace cell burned the body from within, the cold cell froze the soul itself. It was a room of the same size, perhaps 6 feet wide, 10 feet long, but its purpose was the complete opposite. Instead of heat, there was only ice. The floor was stone, always wet, covered with a thin layer of frost. A narrow pipe ran through the wall, channeling air from outside. In the Russian winter, that meant temperatures below freezing, sometimes 10 or even 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Prisoners were forced to stand naked inside. There was no blanket, no stool, no mercy. The guards poured water onto the floor until it turned to ice. Within minutes, toes went numb. Within an hour, the legs lost feeling. Skin began to turn blue, lips purple, eyes glassy. When the body started shaking uncontrollably, the guards would open the door, not to release the prisoner, but to throw a bucket of cold water over him, ensuring that the freezing began all over again. Some were kept inside for 6 or 8 hours, some through the entire night. In the morning, their joints no longer moved. Their fingers cracked and bled. Many could not walk, their feet swollen and blackened by frostbite. For those who survived, amputation often followed. But what broke them first was not pain. It was hopelessness. The kind of despair that comes when even your own body begins to feel like an enemy. One officer, Ivan Slivkin, endured the cold cell 3 times. When interrogators asked for his confession, he signed without reading. Years later, he would tell a friend, "I thought death would come like sleep, but it came slowly, in the cold." The NKVD learned quickly that cold could be as persuasive as fire. Sukhanovka became a place of extremes: heat and ice, silence and screams, darkness and blinding light. In its balance of opposites, the prison created one perfect truth. Suffering was not an accident here. It was the design. Of all the methods used inside Sukhanovka, sleep deprivation was the most silent, and perhaps the most effective. It left no visible scars, no blood, no burns, no broken bones, only hollow eyes, trembling hands, and a mind unraveling thread by thread. Prisoners were locked in narrow cells where they were forbidden to sit or lie down. The moment someone tried to rest, a guard would strike the door with a metal rod or shout through a small opening, "Stand up!" The light above never went out, a single bulb burning through day and night until time itself lost meaning. At first, the body fought back. After 1 night without sleep, a prisoner could still think, still remember who he was. After 2 nights, thoughts began to slip. Words tangled. After 3 nights, reality started to dissolve. The walls seemed to move. Shadows took shape. Whispers appeared where there was no one at all. By the 5th day, prisoners were talking to themselves, answering questions no one had asked. Some began to laugh uncontrollably, others to cry. By the 7th day, the body would start collapsing on its own, the brain forcing brief moments of unconsciousness, seconds of stolen rest before being jolted awake again. One woman, Evgenia Ginsburg, endured 9 days without sleep. She later wrote that her mind began to float somewhere between dream and delirium. "I no longer understood who was interrogating whom," she recalled. "Sometimes it felt like I was questioning myself." After a week, even the strongest minds broke. They signed whatever was placed before them, confessions, accusations, anything to end the endless waking. The NKVD called it the conveyor. Interrogators worked in shifts, always fresh, while the prisoner stood trembling, eyes burning, lost inside his own exhaustion. In Sukhanovka, sleep became a forbidden luxury, a memory of another world. And when sleep finally came, it was not mercy. It was surrender. If sleep deprivation blurred the edges of sanity, the conveyor erased them completely. It was not one session, not one night, not even one interrogator. It was an unbroken sequence, day flowing into night, night into day, until time itself ceased to exist. The system was simple. Interrogators worked in rotating shifts of 4 hours each. The prisoner, however, never rested. One officer would leave, another would enter. The questions continued without pause. Names, dates, contacts, confess. Voices changed, faces changed, but the pressure never stopped. For the first day, the prisoner tried to reason. For the second, he argued. By the third, speech became slurred. After 5 days, words lost meaning. After 7, reality collapsed. The mind, deprived of sleep and overwhelmed by repetition, began to accept anything just to make it end. One survivor, writer Lev Razgon, described it as a machine that crushed thought. He remembered sitting under a blinding lamp while questions came like hammer blows. I stopped answering. Then I began to whisper. Then I just nodded. After a while, I didn't know if I was confessing or dreaming. The interrogators themselves became part of the rhythm, emotionless, mechanical, each one following the script written by the state. They did not need to shout. They only needed time. Because in Sukhanovka, time itself was a weapon. Every session ended the same way, a trembling hand signing papers that no longer mattered. Confessions written in exhaustion, sealed with silence. The NKVD called it productive interrogation. They noted success rates of nearly 100%. When it was over, the prisoner was led back to his cell, or what was left of him. Some collapsed on the floor and slept for 20 hours straight, unmoving, faces pale as ash. Others never spoke again. The conveyor was not designed to extract truth. It was designed to prove the system's power, to turn human will into dust through the slow, endless grinding of time. Not every form of torture in Sukhanovka involved chains or ropes. Some were designed for something deeper, to strip away dignity, to destroy the idea that the victim was still a human being. The NKVD understood that once a man stopped believing in his own worth, his mind would do the rest of the work for them. Humiliation became a science. Prisoners were ordered to perform meaningless tasks for hours, to crawl in circles, to clean the same patch of floor with their bare hands, to bow before portraits of Stalin until their necks stiffened. They were mocked, spat on, slapped without warning. Interrogators insulted their families, their faith, their intellect. The goal was not information. It was transformation. To turn a person into an object that could be reshaped at will. Food was used as a tool of degradation. Bowls of thin soup were thrown onto the floor, forcing prisoners to lick it up like animals. In some cases, they were made to drink dirty water, or to stand for hours surrounded by filth that they were forbidden to clean. Guards laughed while watching, a theater of domination in which cruelty was entertainment. One survivor recalled being locked in a cell filled with insects. "At first I tried to kill them," he wrote. "Then I gave up. I understood that everything here was meant to remind me. I am nothing." The worst part, survivors said, was not what the torturers did, but how methodically they did it. There was no rage, no emotion, only procedure. A guard lighting a cigarette while watching a man crawl. An officer taking notes as someone wept. Indifference, not hatred, became the ultimate weapon. In Sukhanovka, pain was predictable, but humiliation was endless. It invaded the mind, whispering that resistance was meaningless. When a person began to believe that, the NKVD no longer needed whips or heat. They had already won. Inside Sukhanovka, even silence could not be trusted. Every word, every glance, every sigh might be a weapon. Because in this place, betrayal was not the exception. It was the rule. The NKVD filled its cells with informants, men and women who looked like ordinary prisoners but worked for the interrogators. They were known simply as plants. Their job was to listen, to observe, and to report every detail. Who cried at night? Who cried at night? Who whispered a prayer? Who dared to speak against the system? Sometimes they provoked conversation, pretending to share pain or doubt, only to repeat the words later in a report. A new arrival might meet a cellmate who seemed kind, offering water, sharing a scrap of bread, whispering advice. Days later, the same cellmate would vanish. Soon after, the prisoner would be called in for questioning, confronted with his own words, now written down verbatim. There was no defense, no denial. Every thought could be turned into evidence. The tactic was devastatingly effective. Within weeks, Sukhanovka became a place where no one trusted anyone. Prisoners stopped speaking altogether, afraid that a simple phrase, a sigh, a curse, even a prayer, might cost their life. Some went mute for months. Others turned paranoid, convinced that even the walls could hear. One former party worker, known only as Kovalyov, believed he had found a friend in his cell, a man who listened to his fears and swore secrecy. When Kovalyov confessed that he no longer believed in Stalin's justice, he sealed his fate. The next day, he was dragged to interrogation, beaten, and sentenced to death based on that one sentence. The friend never returned. The NKVD called it psychological filtration. It was not enough to torture the body. They wanted to infect trust itself. In Sukhanovka, solitude was impossible, yet loneliness was absolute. Even the simple act of speaking became dangerous. Silence was no longer peace. It was survival. Not all torture in Sukhanovka took place under the sound of screams. Some of it wore a doctor's coat. Behind locked infirmary doors, medicine itself became a weapon. Precise, silent, and efficient. Officially, these rooms were called medical observation units. In reality, they were laboratories of control. Prisoners brought here were told they were receiving treatment, an injection for nerves, a sedative to calm the heart, a test for resilience. The truth was far darker. These injections contained experimental mixtures, barbiturates, hallucinogens, stimulants, designed to break the boundary between waking and dreaming, truth and illusion. The NKVD called it chemical persuasion. The goal was simple: to make the prisoner confess without the visible marks of violence. After the first injection, a feeling of warmth spread through the body. After the second, the world began to blur. Walls moved, light shifted, time stretched. Under questioning, the mind became porous, words slipping out unfiltered, logic dissolving in the chemical haze. One physicist, Anatoly Marchenko, was subjected to a series of these treatments. He later wrote that after the third injection, he could no longer distinguish the interrogator's voice from his own thoughts. "It was as if my brain was melting," he recalled. "I confessed to things I didn't even understand." Doctors took notes meticulously: pulse, reactions, duration, resistance. They spoke in clinical language. Subject demonstrates compliance after 2 doses. There was no anger, no sadism, only observation, and that made it worse. Torture delivered in the language of science sounded almost reasonable. Some prisoners never woke up. Their files were marked heart failure, and their bodies disappeared into unmarked graves. Others survived but were left hollow, trembling, paranoid, unable to think clearly again. In Sukhanovka, the boundary between medicine and cruelty vanished. The syringe replaced the whip, the doctor replaced the executioner, and the human mind itself, once the last refuge of truth, became another field of experimentation for a state determined to own even the thoughts of its victims. In Sukhanovka, starvation was not a punishment, it was a method. The interrogators discovered early that hunger could do what no whip could: make a person beg to betray himself. Food was control. Prisoners could go for 10 days without a single proper meal. Each morning, a guard slid a bowl of hot water with a few grains of barley through a narrow hatch and called it soup. A piece of bread the size of a matchbox was considered a privilege. Those who resisted interrogation were simply left off the ration list. The message was clear. Confession meant survival, at least for another day. After several days without food, the body turned against itself. The stomach ached first, then the pain dulled into numbness. Muscles weakened, skin grew pale, hair began to fall out in clumps. The mind started to wander. Prisoners dreamed of food, smelled bread that wasn't there, saw visions of steaming bowls and family tables. One prisoner, Anna Larina, survived 12 days without food. On the 13th day, she was brought into the interrogation room. The investigator placed a bowl of porridge and a piece of bread on the table. "You can eat," he said, "if you sign." She tried to resist, but the smell, the warmth, it was unbearable. She signed. Then she ate, crying between bites. Water, too, was turned into an instrument of suffering. Sometimes they gave none at all. Sometimes they gave only salt, soup, herring, pickled cabbage, and denied water afterward. After a few hours, thirst became a fire inside the body. Prisoners licked condensation from the walls, drank their own urine, begged for a single sip. One engineer, Mikhail Gromov, lasted 3 days without water before collapsing. On the 4th, the interrogator handed him a glass, but it wasn't water. It was urine. "Drink," the officer said. He drank. He confessed. In Sukhanovka, hunger stripped away pride. Thirst stripped away hope. Together, they erased the boundary between man and animal, and left behind only submission. When pain failed and starvation brought no confession, the interrogators of Sukhanovka turned to the one thing that broke almost everyone: family. They understood perfectly. A man might endure any torture himself, but he could not endure the thought of his children suffering. So, they used love as a weapon. During interrogations, officers would open a folder, pull out a photograph, and place it on the table. A wife, a child, a mother. "They're under arrest too," the interrogator would say, "but their fate depends on you." Most of the time it was a lie, but in that moment, the lie was enough. One prisoner, Colonel Vladimir Petrov, resisted every method: the rack, the heat chamber, the sleepless nights. He refused to sign. Then one day his interrogator showed him a picture: his wife and 2 small children standing in what looked like a prison courtyard. "They're in Butyrka," he said. "If you don't cooperate, we'll charge them as relatives of a traitor." Petrov broke. He confessed to everything: espionage, conspiracy, treason. 2 weeks later, he was executed. His family had never been arrested. The photograph had been staged. For others, the terror was real. Families of the accused were often labeled members of the family of an enemy of the people. Wives were sent to labor camps. Children were placed in orphanages, renamed, and taught to hate their own parents. The system turned love itself into an extension of the interrogation room. One interrogator later admitted that using families was the most effective persuasion method. It required no violence, no effort, only a few words and a photograph. A father's fear for his children, he said, was worth more than 10 hours of torture. In Sukhanovka, the cruelty was not in what they did to the body, but in how they made the soul betray itself. When a man signed his confession to save his wife, or a mother lied to protect her child, the NKVD did not just destroy individuals. It corrupted the very idea of love. The interrogators of Sukhanovka were not monsters born. They were made. They lived in a world where cruelty was called duty, and obedience was the highest virtue. Most of them were young, men in their 20s and 30s, promoted for loyalty, not intelligence. They were told that their victims were enemies of the state, that truth was irrelevant, and that confession was victory. Each interrogator had a quota, a certain number of confessions to deliver, a certain number of names to extract. Failure to meet the plan could mean suspicion, demotion, even arrest. And so they worked tirelessly, methodically, like accountants of pain. Every confession was a number in a report, every broken prisoner a completed task. One of them, Senior Lieutenant Alexander Langlebin, became a legend among his peers. Cold, meticulous, almost polite, he was known for describing torture like a scientist explaining an experiment. He recorded how long a man could last in the swallow, how the body reacted to heat, at what point the spine began to fail. His notebook was said to contain hundreds of such entries. When asked years later why he did it, he answered simply, "It was my job." The interrogators had their own routines. After a day of beatings and screams, they gathered in a separate dining room, a small, dimly lit space with portraits of Stalin on the walls. They drank vodka, smoked, and exchanged stories as if discussing a day at the factory. They laughed at the prisoners' screams, compared techniques, competed in efficiency. For them, the suffering of others had become background noise, the rhythm of their profession. Not all of them were sadists. Some were afraid. One former officer admitted later, "If I refused to sign a torture order, I would be in the cell next day. Fear made us all accomplices." In Sukhanovka, evil wore a uniform, filled out forms, and followed orders. It smiled, it took notes, it went home to dinner. That was its genius, and its horror. The prisoners of Sukhanovka were not thieves or killers. They were the minds and voices of a generation. Scientists, officers, engineers, poets, diplomats. Many had served the state faithfully for years, believing in its ideals. And yet, in the machinery of Stalin's terror, loyalty offered no protection. They arrived in armored trucks, blindfolded, hands tied. Each was accused of crimes as absurd as they were deadly: espionage, sabotage, anti-Soviet agitation. Some were accused of plotting against Stalin himself. In reality, most were victims of paranoia, denunciation, or bureaucratic quota. Among them was the Austrian physicist Alexander Weisberg, arrested for alleged spying after years of loyal work in Soviet research institutes. He endured months of interrogations and the infamous Sukhanovka swallow. After surviving, he wrote that truth was no longer measured by facts, but by pain. The celebrated theater director Vsevolod Meyerhold was also sent here. A man who had revolutionized Russian art now found himself beaten on the same floor where monks once prayed. In a letter smuggled from prison, he described being whipped on his legs until he could no longer stand. He confessed to crimes he did not commit. Weeks later, he was executed. His letter survived. There were generals, too, men like Marshal Vasily Blyucher, once a hero of the Civil War. Arrested and sent to Sukhanovka, he endured 2 months of torture before dying in his cell. The official cause? Heart failure. The truth? He was beaten to death. And there were the nameless, teachers, students, workers, whose files were stamped and shelved, whose bodies were buried in unmarked graves. Their families received letters claiming illness or natural causes. Sukhanovka was not a prison for the guilty. It was a mirror for the regime itself, reflecting its fear, its cruelty, and its obsession with control. The people it destroyed were not enemies of the state. They were its conscience. Sukhanovka was not an accident. It was the logical outcome of a system that had replaced morality with fear and justice with obedience. The Soviet state of the late 1930s operated not through law, but through quotas, numbers of arrests, numbers of confessions, numbers of executions. Terror was planned like production. Every region, every prison, every investigator had a target to meet. Orders came from the top, from the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, signed by men whose names were spoken with both reverence and dread. Yezhov, Beria, Stalin. One classified directive issued in the summer of 1937 listed 2 categories. The first, immediate execution. The second, imprisonment for 8 to 10 years. The total number of enemies to be processed, over 360,000. The quota was not a ceiling. It was a starting point. To achieve those numbers, new prisons were needed, efficient, secret, and silent. Sukhanovka became the model. Its success was measured not by truth, but by output. Every forced confession justified another arrest. Every false conspiracy created new accomplices. The logic was circular and self-sustaining. Inside this machinery, interrogators were workers. Victims were raw material. Reports were the finished product. It was not madness. It was administration. The system rewarded efficiency and punished doubt. An investigator who hesitated could be accused of sympathy for the enemy. A judge who questioned evidence risked joining the condemned. Fear climbed down the chain of command until it reached every desk, every cell, every soul. And so, cruelty became policy. Torture became paperwork. Death became a statistic. The great irony was that the system did not need real enemies. It created them, endlessly, mechanically, to justify its own existence. Sukhanovka was not merely a prison. It was a factory of fear, a place where the state learned that the surest way to control a nation is to make everyone afraid, not of what they have done, but of what they might be accused of. When Stalin died in the spring of 1953, the machinery of terror began to slow, not out of conscience, but confusion. Orders stopped. Files gathered dust. The silence inside Sukhanovka was heavier than the screams that had filled it for nearly 2 decades. By 1955, the prison was officially closed. The walls that had once echoed with agony were handed over to the military. Some rooms became storerooms, others offices. The iron doors remained, but the purpose had changed. On paper, Sukhanovka ceased to exist. In reality, it lived on, in the minds of those who survived and the nightmares of those who worked there. A few interrogators were arrested during the wave of re-examinations. They confessed, calmly, mechanically, to the same crimes they had once extracted from others. Senior Lieutenant Langlebin received 15 years for abuse of authority. He served 8. After release, he lived quietly in Moscow, collecting a state pension. He never apologized. Most others escaped punishment. They retired, wrote reports, received medals. Some taught in the security academy, training the next generation of officers. In their personnel files, the words "distinguished service" appeared again and again. As for the survivors, many were released under Khrushchev's amnesty, thin, broken, and silent. They returned to homes that no longer existed, to families that had moved on or perished. Some tried to speak but found no one willing to listen. Others wrote memoirs decades later, their hands trembling, their memories fragmented. For years, even the name Sukhanovka was forbidden. Maps showed nothing. Officially, it had never existed. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union were archives opened, revealing the truth piece by piece. Interrogation logs, doctor's notes, execution lists. Today, the monastery's ruins still stand, surrounded by trees. A small memorial stone bears a simple inscription: "To the victims of political repression." Nothing more. No names, no numbers, just silence. The same silence that once hid the screams. Sukhanovka is gone, but its shadow remains. Because some places never truly close. They wait, inside memory, inside history, for someone brave enough to speak their name aloud. Sukhanovka no longer stands as a prison, yet its presence has not faded. It remains a wound beneath the surface of history, a reminder of how easily power, left unchecked, can turn faith into fear and justice into cruelty. The true horror of Sukhanovka was not only the screams behind stone walls. It was the silence that followed, the decades of denial, the rewriting of memory, the refusal to admit what had been done in the name of security. Entire generations grew up without ever hearing its name. The state buried the truth beneath layers of propaganda, as if forgetting could erase guilt. But history resists burial. When the archives finally opened, the documents spoke, in the calm, bureaucratic language of evil. Lists of prisoners, tables of methods, medical notes describing fractured bones and burned skin. None of it screamed. It simply stated, and that made it unbearable. The survivors who dared to speak, men and women who had lived through the unthinkable, did not ask for vengeance. They asked only for remembrance. If the world forgets, one wrote, it will happen again, only under a different flag. Sukhanovka's legacy is not confined to one country or one ideology. Every regime that worships control more than compassion, every system that values obedience over conscience, carries its echo. From the gulags to secret prisons of later eras, the lesson is the same. Once fear becomes law, humanity becomes expendable. Today, historians, journalists, and descendants of the victims still visit the site, a quiet clearing outside Moscow where the monastery once stood. Birds sing where there were once cries for mercy. Nature has reclaimed the walls, but not the meaning. Sukhanovka stands as both a grave and a warning, that cruelty often hides behind purpose, and that the first step toward tyranny is forgetting. To remember is to resist, to speak is to honor, and to honor is to ensure that what happened in Sukhanovka will never happen again. They walked out through the same gates where thousands had vanished, thin shadows wearing borrowed clothes, blinking at the sun as if it were something foreign. These were the survivors of Sukhanovka, They had outlived the screams, the cold, the interrogations. But no one truly left that place behind. Most of them were released in the mid-1950s, when the state quietly admitted that mistakes had been made. No apologies, no explanations, just a folded piece of paper. Case closed, sentence annulled. Freedom, written in ink. But what followed was not life, it was survival. Many returned to find their families gone, wives remarried, children grown, parents buried without graves. Neighbors avoided them, afraid that a single word of sympathy could bring trouble. "You came back?" some whispered. "Better if you hadn't." At night they woke in panic, hearing footsteps that were not there. They slept fully dressed, waiting for the knock on the door. Some refused to speak about Sukhanovka ever again. Others spoke constantly, as if afraid that silence itself might drag them back inside. A few tried to rebuild. They worked as janitors, mechanics, teachers, anonymous lives in a country that preferred not to remember them. Yet even in that silence, they carried invisible scars. A sudden sound could make them tremble. A closed door could steal their breath. Writer Yevgenia Ginsburg described it best. "They freed my body, but not my nights." Some survivors began writing secretly, using scraps of paper, burned matches for ink. Their memoirs, smuggled abroad decades later, became the first cracks in the wall of denial. They did not seek revenge, only recognition. They wanted the world to know that Sukhanovka was not a nightmare invented by rumor. It was real. And for them, it never truly ended. They escaped the prison, but the prison never escaped them. When a man vanished into Sukhanovka, the silence that followed was part of the punishment. His family received no letter, no verdict, no body. Only the knock on the door and the words, "He's been taken." After that, nothing. For years, sometimes decades. Wives became members of the family of an enemy of the people. It was an official category, printed in black ink on internal passports. It meant dismissal from work, eviction, endless questioning. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid them. Children were mocked at school. Teachers whispered that their fathers were traitors. One woman, Yelena Volkova, was 26 when her husband disappeared. She waited 22 years for an answer. When it finally came, it was a line in an archive. Executed in 1938. By then, she was old, her hair white, her hope long dead. "I buried him twice," she said. "Once when they took him. Once when I learned the truth." Many children of the condemned were placed in state orphanages. Their names were changed. Their parents were called enemies. Some grew up believing those lies, learning only as adults who they really were. One man discovered his father's file at the age of 50. "All my life," he said, "I thought my father was a criminal. Then I saw he was a victim." The families learned to live between grief and fear. They could not mourn. Mourning was forbidden. They could not forget. Forgetting was betrayal. So they waited in silence, building small altars in their hearts, lighting candles for those officially erased. In the end, their endurance became its own form of resistance. They carried memory like a wound, passing it from one generation to the next, until the truth, long buried under official lies, finally began to surface. Sukhanovka destroyed thousands of lives inside its walls, but it haunted millions outside them. For decades, Sukhanovka existed only as a whisper. A rumor passed quietly between those who still dared to remember. The state had erased its name from maps, its records from archives, its victims from history. But memory, like truth, does not vanish. It waits. In the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union began to fracture under its own weight, the silence cracked. Historians, journalists, and relatives of the missing started asking forbidden questions. They dug through archives, searched for documents, traced the faint trails left by the bureaucracy of death. Each discovery was a resurrection, a name restored, a story reclaimed. The organization Memorial became the conscience of that awakening. Volunteers, teachers, engineers, students worked by hand, writing lists of the executed, one card at a time. In basements and kitchens, they read interrogation protocols, letters, and medical reports that had been hidden for half a century. The more they uncovered, the more unbearable the picture became. Former interrogators were sometimes interviewed. Most denied everything. Some said they didn't remember. A few, in trembling voices, admitted, "Yes, it happened, but we were afraid too." Their words fell like stones, heavy, belated, but real. In 1991, the archives of the NKVD and KGB began to open. Inside were the cold remains of a national nightmare. Arrest orders signed by Stalin himself, death lists initialed by Beria, daily reports from Sukhanovka marked "execution carried out." For the first time, the faces of the lost returned, in faded photographs, in handwriting on fragile pages. Museums began to appear. Memorial stones were placed in quiet corners of cities. People came to read the names aloud, to speak what had been unspeakable for 50 years. The reckoning was not about revenge. It was about acknowledgement, about looking into the mirror of history and refusing to turn away. Because nations, like people, cannot heal until they learn to remember. In the end, Sukhanovka is not only about a place, it is about what people can become when fear replaces conscience. The walls may be gone, the cells empty, but the idea that built them still waits in the shadows of every age. Evil rarely begins with monsters. It begins with ordinary men obeying, with doctors writing false diagnoses, with guards saying, "I was just following orders." It grows quietly, through silence, through apathy, through the small decision to look away. The story of Sukhanovka is not a relic of the past. It is a mirror held up to humanity. Every nation, every system, every generation faces the same question. How far will we go when authority tells us that cruelty is necessary? The lesson is not political. It is moral. When truth becomes dangerous, when compassion becomes weakness, when obedience becomes virtue, the architecture of Sukhanovka begins to rebuild itself, brick by brick, inside the human heart. But there is another side to the story. The survivors, the families, the voices that refused to disappear. They prove that even in the darkest systems, something resists. A whisper of dignity, a refusal to surrender, a prayer whispered through bloodied lips. That is where humanity endures. One survivor once said, "They took my freedom, but they never took my choice to remember." That choice is what separates us from the machine. Today, the ruins of Sukhanovka stand silent under trees. The wind moves through the cracks like a ghost. Birds nest where guards once stood watch. The earth itself seems to breathe forgiveness, but not forgetfulness. To remember is to resist. To speak is to heal. To teach is to protect. Because if history has one human lesson, it is this: The moment we stop remembering, it begins again.